Blood has a sound when it leaves you that fast. Not a drip. More like a whisper. Cloth tearing slow, somewhere behind your ribs. Shh. That's what I heard, first, lying face down in the creek mud, with my cheek pressed against a flat stone and the sky doing something wrong above the cottonwoods. My horse was gone. I knew that before I opened my eyes because the ground wasn't moving anymore. Shh. And the last thing I remembered was the bay stumbling sideways, the crack from the ridge, and the punch below my collarbone that didn't feel like a punch at all. Felt like someone pressed a hot iron through me from the back and kept pushing. I was 41 winters old, war chief of the Oglala band. For 11 of those, I had taken bullets before. A graze across my thigh at Rosebud Creek. A pistol ball through the meat of my left arm that came out clean and healed in 6 weeks. Those hurt. This was different. This didn't hurt yet, and I'd been shot enough to know that was the bad sign. The creek ran shallow here, maybe a hand's width over brown stones, and it pooled under my side warm from my own body. The water that ran past my face was clear. The water that ran past my hip was not. I watched the color of it change and thought, so this is the place. Not afraid of it. You understand? I'd sat with dying men since I was 15. Held the hand of my uncle when the sickness took him. Closed the eyes of warriors half my age. A man doesn't fear the thing he's seen that many times. But I will tell you, lying there with my blood running into that little creek in the shadow of the bighorns, I felt something worse than afraid. I felt ordinary. 31 winters, and what I thought was, nobody will sing about this. Shot off a horse like a rabbit off a fence post. Not in a fight. Not standing. Just a bullet from a ridge I didn't even see. And a fall in the mud. I should tell you how I got there. The truth is, I don't remember it the way a story goes. I remember pieces. I remember the campfire 3 nights before, and Red Hawk arguing that we should move the camp south before the first snow. I remember agreeing with him and not saying so, because if I said it, Old Standing Bear would argue the other side just to argue, and we'd sit there until dawn. So I let Two Moon say it instead, and Standing Bear nodded, and we decided, that's the kind chief I was. Not the kind they paint pictures of. The kind who knows which mouth to let the words come from. I remember riding out alone the next morning to check the South Trail, whether the pass near the Twin Rocks was still open or already drifted shut. I remember the cold, early snow that year, fine as dust blowing sideways off the ridges. My bay mare, the one I called Smoke because of the color of her breath in winter, she didn't want to go, kept turning her head back toward camp. I should have listened to her. She was smarter than me about most things. I remember reaching the pass and finding it open. Narrow, but open. And I remember turning back and the feeling, just a prickle on the back of my neck. The kind that tells you eyes are on you. And then the crack, and then I was falling. The shooter, I never saw him. Soldier, probably. Maybe a scout. Maybe a prospector who didn't like Lakota. Riding through what he figured was his country now. Doesn't matter. A bullet doesn't carry a name. Drifted. That's the word for what happens when you're bleeding out slow in cold water, and the sun moves but you can't. Not sleep, not waking, something between, where the world tilts and you see things that aren't there but feel more real than the stones under your ribs. I saw my mother, not her face, her hands. Stripping sinew from an elk tendon, the way she twisted it between her thumb and finger. I could smell the smoke from the lodge fire, and I tried to say something to her, but my mouth was full of creek water, and I coughed, and she was gone. I saw my wife, pale moon, dead 4 winters by then. Fever took her in a single night, and I woke up holding a woman whose skin was already cool. We had no children. She'd wanted them, and I'd wanted them, and the absence of them was a hole neither of us knew how to talk about, so we didn't. We just lived around it. The way you live around a rock, too big to move from your path. You wear a trail beside it, and after a while you forget you're going around. After she died, I didn't look for another woman. Some men do. Some men need the warmth of a body beside them to sleep. I slept fine alone. I had my people to carry. A band of 200 who needed meat and safety, and a chief who didn't flinch. That was enough. That was supposed to be enough. The sun moved. I know because the shadow of the cottonwood that had been over my face slid away, and the light hit my eyes, and I tried to lift my hand to block it and couldn't. That's when I heard the footsteps. Light. Quick. Not a man's walk. Not a horse. Something small and fast, moving through the brush upstream, stopping, moving again. A deer, I thought, let it pass. But it didn't pass. It got closer. And then there was a voice. A girl's voice, high and tight with fear. Saying words I couldn't understand at first because my ears, full of water, and my mind was somewhere between my mother's hands and the cold. English. She was speaking English. One of them. The other was pressed shut against the stone, and I saw bare feet, brown with dirt, scratched, standing in the creek about 4 steps from my face. Small feet, a girl's feet. The hem of a dress that had been blue once, torn nearly to the knee, dark with mud. She said something else. I caught the word dead and the word oh. And then she was on her knees in the water beside me, and I felt a hand, small, cold, shaking, on the side of my neck. You're alive, she said. I could hear her now, young voice, shaking the way a voice shakes when the body behind it has been running a long time. I tried to speak. Came out was a sound like gravel in a bowl. Don't move, she said. Don't. There's blood. There's a lot of. She was quiet then. I could hear her breathing. Fast, ragged, like she'd been running for hours. And then I heard a sound I didn't expect. Tearing sound, cloth ripping. And then pressure, hard and sudden against my chest. And the pain that hadn't come yet arrived all at once, like a wall of white fire. And I heard myself make a sound no war chief should make. And the world went out. I came back in pieces. First, warmth, not sunlight, firelight, the flicker of it on stone above me, which meant I wasn't in the creek anymore. I was somewhere with a ceiling. A rock overhang, maybe. A shallow cave. Second, the smell of pine pitch. Someone had made a fire with green wood, and the smoke was thick and sweet, and it stung the inside of my nose. Third, weight on my chest. Not pain, a pressing, a tightness. I looked down and saw a strip of pale cloth wound around me, shoulder to armpit, stained through, with brown-red but holding. Fourth, her. She was sitting against the far wall of the overhang, maybe 10 feet from me, with her knees pulled up, and her arms wrapped around them, and her eyes open and fixed on me, with an expression I'd seen on young horses. Not fear exactly, greediness, ready to bolt if I moved wrong. She was young, not a child, maybe 16, 17 winters. Thin the way people are thin when they've been hungry too long, not the way they're born. Brown hair cut rough and short, like someone had taken a knife to it in a hurry. A bruise on her left cheekbone, yellow at the edges, which meant it was old. Days old. And those scratched up feet, bare on the stone, with no shoes anywhere I could see. A runaway. I knew it the way you know weather. The short hair, the bruise, the bare feet, the torn dress, the shaking. She was running from someone, and she'd been running hard. I said, in English, because I'd learned enough of it over the years from traders and treaty men. Water. She flinched. Then she unfolded fast, picked up something. A piece of hollowed bark, I saw later, and brought it to me. Knelt beside me and held it to my mouth. Her hands were still shaking, but she held it steady enough. I drank. It was creek water, cold and clean, and it hit my stomach like a fist, and I nearly brought it back up, but I held it down, and after a few breaths, the world got clearer. You carried me, I said. She shook her head. Dragged mostly, she paused. You're heavy. I looked at her. This thin girl with the chopped hair and the old bruise and no shoes, and I tried to understand how she dragged a man my size out of a creek and up under a rock shelf and bound his wound and built a fire. Alone, with nothing. Who shot you? She asked. I don't know. They coming back. I don't know. She looked at the dark outside the overhang, listened. I watched her listen, and I saw something in the set of her jaw that I recognized. Not courage. Stubbornness. The kind that comes from having no other option. What's your name? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding whether a name was safe to give. Eliza, she said. Then, quieter, Eliza craned. I am Red Elk, I said. Of the Oglala. She nodded once. Didn't flinch at the name, didn't pull back. Didn't do any of the things I'd seen white people do when they heard Lakota. She just nodded and went back to her place against the wall and pulled her knees up again and watched me. I'll tell you something I've never said to anyone. That first night in the overhang, when the fire burned down to coals and the cold crept in and I could hear her teeth chattering from across the cave, I wanted to die. From the pain. The pain was a living thing by then, a hot animal curled inside my chest that bit me every time I breathed. But I'd borne pain before. No, I wanted to die because I was ashamed. A war chief of the Oglala, dragged from a creek by a white girl with no shoes. Couldn't stand, couldn't sit up, couldn't feed myself or tend my own wound. I was meat. I was nothing. And this girl, this runaway child with bruises on her face and hunger, hollowing her cheeks, she was the only thing between me and the coyotes. Pride is a sickness in men. I know that now. Then I only knew it was eating me alive, and the bullet hadn't managed to. She got up sometime in the deepest part of the night. I heard her moving. Thought she was leaving. Thought, good. Let her go. The cold take me and be done. But she wasn't leaving. She was feeding the fire. Handful of twigs, then a branch, then another. The warmth pushed back against the dark, and I heard her settle down again. Closer this time between me and the opening. She was blocking the cold, or blocking whatever might come in. I said, you should go, in the morning. Follow the creek south, you'll find a road. She was quiet so long I thought she'd fallen asleep. Then she said, I'm not going anywhere. I'm dying, I told her, flat, because I believed it. No, you're not, she said, and the way she said it. Not gentle, not kind, just stubborn, like she was correcting a wrong answer. I almost laughed. If laughing wouldn't have torn me open. She didn't go. 3 days I lay in that overhang, and she didn't go. She found things. I don't know how. A girl with no tools, no knowledge of this country, bare feet, on frozen ground, but she found things. Tst. Roots I recognized that she must have dug with her fingers, because her nails were black with soil. A rabbit. She caught a snare made from a strip of her own dress hem. She roasted it on a green stick over the fire, and it was burnt on the outside and raw near the bone, and she pulled it apart and fed me pieces with her dirty fingers, and I ate because she stood over me with that jaw set until I did. She changed the bandage. That was the worst part. She'd torn her dress into strips. The dress was half gone by then, and she'd wrapped what was left around herself with a piece of rope she'd found somewhere, and she'd pull the old cloth away from the wound, and I could see her face when she looked at it. She went pale every time, but her hands didn't shake anymore. She'd press the new cloth in, tight, and tie it off, and her lips would be pressed together hard enough to go white, and she wouldn't look at my face. I asked her, on the second day, who she was running from. She was sitting by the fire, feeding it sticks one at a time. She didn't look up. A man, she said. Your father? No. A pause. A man my father sold me to. She said it the way you say the sky is gray. No feeling in it, just a fact, laid down flat. I didn't ask more. I'd seen enough of the world to know what that meant. A girl sold. A girl used. A girl who finally ran. The short hair, the bruise, the bare feet. She'd left with nothing because she had nothing, and she'd run until she couldn't run anymore. And she'd found a bleeding man in a creek, and instead of running past, instead of saving herself, any sensible person would have done, she'd stopped. I didn't understand that yet. It would take me a long time. On the fourth morning I sat up. It nearly killed me. The world swam, and the pain in my chest bloomed out in every direction, like a fire catching dry grass, and I tasted copper in the back of my throat. But I sat up. I put my back against the stone wall of the overhang, and I breathed, and the world steadied. Eliza was outside. I could hear her at the creek, splashing, the sound of something being washed. She came back carrying the bark bowl full of water, and stopped when she saw me sitting. She didn't say anything, just stood there with the water, looking at me, and I saw something move across her face that I couldn't read. Later I'd know it was relief. At the time it just looked like her eyes got brighter for a second, and then she walked over and handed me the water and said, "You look terrible." "I've looked worse," I said, which was a lie. She sat down across from me. We drank water and ate the last of the rabbit, cold and tough, and she told me, in pieces, the way real talk comes not all at once, that she'd been walking for 11 days before she found me. 11 days, barefoot, through the mountains, in early winter. She'd eaten berries she wasn't sure about, and gotten sick twice. She'd slept in hollows and under deadfalls, and once up a tree when she heard wolves. 11 days, and she was still alive. And on the 12th, instead of pushing on, she'd stopped to save a stranger. "Why?" I asked her. She looked at me like it was a stupid question. "Because you were dying. I'm Lakota." "I know. Most of your people would have walked past." She pulled at a thread on what was left of her dress, wound it around her finger, unwound it. "I'm not most of my people," she said. And then, quiet, like she was telling me something she'd only just figured out, "I'm not really any people. Not anymore." I won't tell you the recovery was quick, because it wasn't. Weeks. The bullet had gone through below my collarbone and come out my back, and it had nicked something in there that made my left arm weak and my breathing shallow for a long time. There were days I coughed blood, and Eliza would sit beside me and hold the bark bowl and say nothing and wait. I was ashamed of those days, a chief, helpless. Something shifted in the shame as the weeks passed. Something I didn't have a word for then. She kept us alive. I need you to understand that. This girl, half-starved, 17 winters old, with no skill in the woods and no weapon and no shoes, she kept us alive, she learned. Fast. I told her which roots to dig, and she dug them. I showed her, one-armed, how to set a snare with sinew, and she set 6, and checked them at dawn and dusk, and caught enough to keep meat on the fire. I told her how to read the sky for weather, and she'd stand outside the overhang at first light, and come back and tell me what she saw, and she was right more often than wrong. There was a test. There's always a test with any people, and if you think otherwise, you've never lived among anyone different from yourself. This came on a morning when the temperature dropped so hard, the water in the cooking pot froze solid overnight. The women were breaking ice from the creek to melt for drinking water, and Eliza was among them, and a young woman named Bright Leaf. She'd lost her brother to soldiers 2 summers before, and she had no love for any white face. Said something sharp in Lakota. Something about a white dog lapping Lakota water. The other women went quiet. Eliza stood in the creek with a chunk of ice in her hands, and I could see from across the camp that she understood enough of the words to know what was said. Her shoulders went tight, her jaw locked, and for a moment I thought she would cry or walk away or look to me for help, and I braced for it, because if she did, it would undo everything. She didn't. She looked at Brightleaf, and she said, in Lakota, halting but clear, "This dog carried water for your chief when he was dying. If you want to carry it instead, you can have the creek." Nobody laughed. But Walks in Mourning turned away to hide her face, and 2 moons' oldest son suddenly needed to check on the horses, and Brightleaf stared at Eliza for a long count of 5. And then she bent down and broke another piece of ice, and carried it up the bank without another word. That was the test. Not the only one. There would be others, smaller, quieter. But that was the one that mattered. After that morning, Brightleaf never spoke against Eliza again. A year later, they'd be scraping hides side by side, talking in a mix of Lakota and English that nobody else could follow, laughing at things that weren't funny to anyone but them. She made me moccasins. I still don't know how. Found a deer hide, an old one, stiff, half-cured by the cold, and she cut it with the knife she'd finally found wedged in a rock crack downstream, a rusted trade knife some trapper had lost years ago. She cut the hide and stitched it with pine root and made herself a pair of moccasins that were ugly and lopsided and held together for about 3 days. Then she made another pair, then another. The 5th pair held, and after that her feet stopped bleeding. She never made a pair for me. I asked her about that much later, and she said, "You had boots." And I did. I'd been wearing elk-hide boots when I was shot, and she'd left them on my feet the whole time. She'd taken care of my feet before her own without once mentioning it. That was Eliza. She did things and didn't say. The day I stood up, truly stood, not leaning on the wall, not gripping her shoulder, stood on my own legs with my backs straight and the cold air on my face. She was down at the creek, washing the bandages. She didn't see me. I walked, slow, unsteady, each step a negotiation with my chest, to the edge of the overhang and stood in the light. The valley below was white with early snow. The creek ran dark through it, and the cottonwoods had dropped their leaves, and the sky was the hard pale blue that comes before deep winter. Hawks circled the far ridge. The air smelled like ice and pine and wood smoke from our fire. I stood there and breathed, and the breathing didn't hurt, or it hurt less, and I realized something had changed that I couldn't put back. I needed her. Not the way a wounded man needs a nurse. That was over, or nearly. I needed her the way you need water after you've forgotten you were thirsty. The camp I'd left, my people, the band I'd led, I'd carry them again. I knew that. But this girl, this runaway with her stubborn jaw and her ruined dress and her ugly moccasins, she'd crawled into the empty space in me that I'd been walking around for years. The way I'd walked around the whole pale moon's death had left, and she'd filled it with nothing but presence, just being there, just staying. She came up from the creek with the wet bandages over her arm and saw me standing and stopped. "You're up," she said. "I'm up." She looked at me, really looked. Not checking the wound, not reading my face for pain. Just looking, the way you look at something you've built with your hands and can't quite believe it's standing. "Good," she said, and walked past me into the overhang and hung the bandages by the fire to dry. There was a morning, the third week, I think, though I'd lost count by then, when I woke before her. The fire had burned to ash, and the overhang was cold, and the light outside was that thin gray that comes just before dawn in the mountains. She was asleep on her side, wrapped in the rabbit skin blanket, back to me, and I could see the knobs of her spine, through the thin cloth of her dress, the short hair on the back of her neck, the way her hand, even in sleep, was curled around the handle of the trade knife. She slept with that knife every night. I'd noticed but hadn't said anything. A person who's been sold and used sleeps with a weapon. I understood it. I didn't take it personally. But that morning, watching her in the gray light, I made a decision. Not a big one. Not a declaration. Just a shift, like a river changing course by a hand's width. I decided I would get strong enough to stand between this girl and whatever she was dreaming about when her hand tightened on that knife, not because she needed me to. She'd proven she could survive alone. She'd survived harder things alone than most warriors face. But because I could, and because it mattered. A man who can't protect isn't a man, and I'd been lying down too long. I started working my body that day, slow, pressing my hand against the stone wall, pushing, feeling the muscles in my chest pull and burn, flexing my left hand, opening and closing it, fighting the weakness. Walking to the mouth of the overhang and back, then to the creek and back, then further. Each day further. Eliza watched me but didn't comment. Only once, when I stumbled coming back up the slope and caught myself hard against a tree, she appeared at my elbow. I don't know where she came from. She moved quiet as smoke when she wanted to, and steadied me with her hand on my back. Then she walked away. No fuss, no hovering, just the hand and then gone. That was better than any medicine. Being treated like a man who was getting stronger, not a patient who might break. One night toward the end of the third week, a sound woke me. Not outside, inside. She was crying. Quiet, the way people cry when they've learned that crying brings punishment. Almost no sound at all, just the shaking of her body under the rabbit skin blanket and the catch of her breath. I didn't touch her, didn't speak. I just shifted on my side so my back was closer to hers. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth, and I stayed awake until the crying stopped and her breathing went slow and even again. In the morning, she was up before me, feeding the fire. Her face was dry and her jaw was set, and neither of us said a word about it. But that night, she laid her blanket closer to mine. Not much, a hand's width. And the night after that, another hand's width. And by the end of that week, she slept with her back against mine, and the trade stayed tucked in her belt instead of her hand, and I thought, this is trust being built. One hand's width at a time. We couldn't stay. The snows were coming hard, and the overhang wouldn't hold against a real blizzard. I needed to get back to my people, and she had nowhere to go. I didn't say that. She knew it. I said, come with me. We were sitting by the fire. I'd been up for 3 days by then, moving more each day, rebuilding the strength in my legs. My left arm was still weak, but I could use it. I could ride, if I had a horse. I could walk, if I had to. She was stitching a tear in the rabbitskin blanket she'd been piecing together over the weeks, a patchwork thing, ugly and warm, that she slept under. Her hands stopped. Come with you where? To my camp, my people. She was quiet. I watched her hands. They didn't move. I'm white, she said. I know what you are. Your people won't want me. My people will do as I say. She looked up at me then, and I saw it. The thing in her eyes that I'd been seeing in pieces, in flashes, since that first night when she'd fed the fire and sat between me and the dark. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't need. It was something harder and quieter than both. She trusted me. This girl who'd been sold by her father and used by a stranger and beaten and starved and run 11 days through the mountains. She trusted me. Not because I'd earned it with words. I'd barely spoken. She trusted me because of what I hadn't done. I hadn't touched her, hadn't demanded, hadn't presumed, hadn't once, in all those weeks, treated her as anything less than the person who'd saved my life. Which is what she was. Trust from a woman who has no reason to trust is worth more than any coup counted in battle. I knew that in my bones the moment I saw it in her eyes. All right, she said, and went back to her stitching. The walk took 4 days. I won't make it into something it wasn't. It was hard and slow, cold. My chest ached with every step, and by the end of each day I was breathing through my teeth. Eliza walked beside me, matching my pace, never once suggesting we stop, even when I could see her watching my face for the signs she'd learned. The tightening around my mouth, the way I held my left arm against my ribs. She'd found a walking stick for me, a length of ash, stripped and smoothed with the trade knife. I leaned on it, more than I wanted to, and less than I needed to. We didn't talk much on the trail, but on the second night, camped under a rock shelf with a fire between us and the wind, she told me about her mother. Dead when Eliza was 9, fever, the same as pale moon, and her father, a man who'd been broken by the loss and put himself back together wrong, with whiskey and cruelty, and finally, the sale of his own daughter to a man who ran cattle 3 valleys over and needed someone to cook and clean and bear what he did at night. She told it flat, no tears. She'd used those up a long time ago, I think. I told her about Pale Moon. Not everything. A man doesn't say everything, but enough. How she'd laughed. How she'd known the name of every plant that grew along the river and could find water in places that looked dry as bone. How the lodge had felt after she was gone, like a drum with the skin cut away. The shape was there, but the sound was finished. Eliza listened, didn't say she was sorry. Didn't say she understood. Just listened, with the firelight on her face and her hands wrapped around her knees. And when I was done, she said, "She sounds like someone I would have liked." I don't know why that hit me the way it did. Simple words, but they landed in the empty place and stayed. We came to the camp on the afternoon of the 4th day. I saw the smoke first, the thin columns rising from the lodges in the cold air, and then the horses, and then the people. Red Hawk saw us first. He was on watch at the south edge of camp, and I watched his face go through 3 things in about 2 breaths. Shock that I was alive, confusion at the girl beside me, and then something that settled into respect when he saw the way I was walking. Upright, slow, hurting, but upright. he called out. People came. And then I was surrounded by my people, and the voices were all talking at once. And old Standing Bear was gripping my good arm and saying my name over and over like he was trying to convince himself. Eliza stood behind me. I could feel her there. The stillness of her, the readiness to bolt. And I turned and put my hand on her shoulder and said, loud enough for everyone, "This woman saved my life. She will stay." Silence, the kind that has weight. Then Two Moon's wife, a woman named Walks in Mourning, who had a face like carved stone and a heart the size of the whole valley, stepped forward and took Eliza by the arm, gently, and led her toward the fire, and sat her down and put a bowl of hot stew in her hands. Eliza looked up at me over the rim of the bowl. Her eyes were wet and she was shaking, not from cold, not this time, and I nodded once. And she drank. The winter was hard. They're all hard, but this one had teeth. Snow piled high against the lodges, and the creek froze solid for weeks. We lost 4 horses to the cold and 2 elders to the sickness that comes when the air turns to ice. Eliza lived in Walks in Mourning's lodge. At first, she learned faster than anyone I've seen. Faster than sense, almost. Within a month, she was scraping hides alongside the women, her hands raw and red. And she never complained, not once. She learned words, Lakota words, and used them wrong at first and made the children laugh. And then she used them right and made the children quiet with respect. I watched her from a distance. A chief doesn't hover. A chief doesn't show need. But I watched. She made a pair of moccasins. Beautiful ones. Beaded in the style Walks in Mourning taught her, blue and white and red, in a pattern that meant. She didn't know this when she chose the colors. Safe return. She brought them to my lodge one evening when the snow was falling thick, and the camp was quiet, and the only sound was the fire popping inside. She held them out. Didn't say anything. I took them. Turned them over in my hands. The stitching was fine and even, nothing like those first ugly pairs she'd made in the overhang. The beadwork was careful, each bead placed right. "I made you moccasins," she said. And then, like it needed explaining, "You had boots before, but these are better." I looked at her. She was cleaner now, fed, hair growing back in soft brown waves, the bruise on her cheek long gone. She wore a deerskin dress that Walks in Mourning had made for her, and she stood in the door of my lodge, with snowflakes on her shoulders and her chin up and her eyes steady on mine. She was beautiful. I hadn't let myself see it before. Or maybe she hadn't been before. Maybe beauty needs something under it, a foundation, the way a lodge needs poles. She'd built hers back from nothing, and now it was there, and it hit me in the chest, harder than the bullet had. "Stay," I said. Not come with me. I'd said that already back in the overhang. This was different. This was a man standing in his own lodge, asking a woman to be in it. She knew what I meant. She stepped inside, sat down across the fire from me, pulled off her old moccasins, the 5th pair, the ones that had held, and put on a new pair she'd made for herself, matching mine. She didn't say yes. She just sat there in my lodge wearing matching moccasins, and the fire popped and the snow fell, and I understood that this was her answer, and it was enough. There were those who didn't like it. I won't pretend otherwise. A white woman in a Lakota camp in a chief's lodge, it raised voices. Standing Bear, who argued with everything, argued with this too. Said it was wrong, said it was dangerous, said the soldiers would use it as an excuse to come down on us harder. I listened. A chief listens. And then I said, "She saved my life when she had no reason to. She stayed when she could have walked away. She is braver than most warriors I have known, and I will not send her out." Standing Bear looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at Eliza, who was outside the council lodge, splitting firewood with the trade knife like she'd been doing it her whole life. The axe landing clean and true. "She swings that knife like she's angry at the wood," he said. "She's angry at a lot of things," I said. "The wood can take it." He almost smiled. Standing Bear almost never smiled. But the corner of his mouth moved just barely, and he said, "Fine, but if the soldiers come, she talks to them." My English is terrible. Spring came the way it does in that country, not gentle, but sudden, like someone kicked open a door. The snow went to mud, the creek roared with meltwater, and the grass came up green and thick in the meadows, and the horses got fat, and the camp felt alive again after the long-held breath of winter. Eliza and I had been together in the lodge for 4 months by then. I want to tell you how it was, but the truth is, the best of it doesn't make for a story. The best of it was ordinary, waking up with her warmth beside me. The smell of the stew she'd learned to make from walks in morning. Elk and wild turnip, heavy on the turnip, because she liked it that way. The sound of her voice outside, talking to the women, mixing Lakota and English, in ways that made sense to everyone and followed no rule. The way she'd come in at dusk and sit beside me and lean her shoulder against mine and say nothing. And the nothing was the whole world. I was not a soft man. I want you to understand that. I had led warriors. I had killed men in battle and sat in councils that decided the fate of the band. I carried that weight, and I carried it well, and I did not put it down, because a woman leaned her shoulder against mine. But I carried it lighter. She gave me that, not by trying, not by any grand act or word. Just by being the person who, when I came back to the lodge, at the end of a long day of hard decisions and harder truths, looked up and saw me. Not the chief, not the war record, me. The man who was tired, whose shoulder ached where the bullet had gone through, who was getting gray at the temples, and would never admit it. She saw that man, and she stayed anyway. That's the whole of it. That's the gift. The soldiers came in midsummer. A patrol, 12 men, led by a young lieutenant with a new uniform and the nervous eyes of a man who'd read about Indians but never talked to one. They came to the edge of camp, and the lieutenant asked to speak with the chief, and I walked out to meet him with Eliza beside me. The lieutenant looked at her, looked at me. His hand moved toward his sidearm, just a twitch, and 3 of my warriors shifted behind me, and for about 5 heartbeats, the whole meadow was a held breath. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said, "are you here of your own free will?" Eliza looked at him. She was standing straight, her hand resting on my arm, not gripping it, resting, the way you rest your hand on something you're sure of. Her chin was up. The bruise was long gone, and the hollows in her cheeks were filled. Her eyes were clear and hard and calm. "I am exactly where I choose to be," she said. The lieutenant looked at her hand on my arm, looked at my face. I don't know what he saw there. A Lakota chief, a scar below the collarbone, gray in the hair, steady eyes. Whatever he saw, he decided it wasn't his fight. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he tipped his hat, and the patrol turned and rode away, and Eliza's hand tightened on my arm. Just once, just a squeeze, and then released. That night in the lodge she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He could have taken me. He could have tried. You would have fought them." "Yes." She was quiet again. Then she rolled onto her side and put her hand flat on my chest, over the scar, and said, "I'm glad I stopped at that creek." I put my hand over hers. Fingers were calloused now. From hide scraping, from wood splitting, from the hard work of a Lakota woman's life that she'd taken on without once asking for easier, could feel the ridges and roughness of her palm against the ridged and rough scar the bullet had left, and I thought, 2 broken things that fit together at the broken places. I didn't say that. I'm saying it now to you, because now I have the words. Then I just held her hand against my chest and listened to the fire and the creek and the wind in the cottonwoods and the sound of the camp settling into sleep, and I was not empty. For the first time in 4 winters, I was not empty. There's a day I come back to. Not the day I was shot. That one fades, the way pain fades, leaving only the knowledge that it happened. Not the day she found me in the creek, though I carry that too. The day I come back to is small, ordinary, the kind of day that doesn't make a story. Early autumn, the year after. The aspens turning gold along the ridge. I was sitting outside the lodge, mending a bridle. My left hand still weaker than the right, still fumbling with the fine work, and she came around the side of the lodge carrying a clay pot she'd made. Lopsided, like her first moccasins. She'd been learning pottery from an old woman named Crow Feather, and she was terrible at it, and she kept trying. She set the pot down beside me. It was full of water, and it wasn't leaking, and she looked at it with an expression of such fierce satisfaction that I laughed. I laughed, and she looked at me, startled. I don't think she'd heard me laugh before, and then she laughed too. And the sound of it went out over the camp, and the meadow, and the creek, and the aspens turning gold. And a dog barked somewhere, and a child shouted, and the world was ordinary and whole. That's the day I come back to, not because anything happened, because nothing needed to. We had a daughter the following spring. Eliza labored through the night, and Walks in Morning was with her, and I sat outside the lodge in the dark and listened and did the most helpless thing a man can do, which is wait. I had fought battles. I had bled out in a creek and crawled back to living. None of it prepared me for sitting in the dark, while a woman I loved made sounds of pain. Stop. Dawn came. The crying came with it, not Eliza's, a new sound, thin and high and furious, the sound of someone arriving in the world and not happy about the cold. Walks in Morning came out and looked at me and said, "A girl. Strong lungs." I went inside. Eliza was lying on the buffalo robe, wrecked and shining with sweat, and she had the baby against her chest. A small, dark-haired thing with a red face and fists, clenched tight, like she was ready to fight somebody. Eliza looked up at me. She was exhausted, her hair plastered to her face, her lips cracked. She'd never been more beautiful. "Come, meet your daughter," she said. I knelt beside her, put my hand, the weak one, the left, the one the bullet had made clumsy, on the baby's back. She was so small, so warm. Her fist unclenched, and her fingers wrapped around my thumb, and the grip was stronger than it had any right to be. Eliza said, "What do we call her?" I looked at the baby. At her dark hair, her fierce fists, the way she'd arrived screaming and was now quiet against her mother's chest, already settled, already home. "Creek," I said. Eliza smiled. Not big. She was too tired for big. But it reached her eyes, and she leaned her head against my shoulder. And I felt the weight of her, and the weight of the baby, and the weight of the life we'd made from nothing but a bullet wound, and a girl who refused to walk past. I am an old man now. The world has changed around me in ways I won't speak of here, because they don't belong in this story. What belongs is this. There was a creek, and I was dying in it, and a girl with no shoes and a torn dress and nowhere to go in the world knelt down in the bloody water and put her hand on my neck and said, "You're alive." She was right, but not yet. Not until her. The moccasins she made me that first winter, the beaded ones, blue and white and red, the pattern that meant safe return, I kept them. They're here. The leather is soft now. Worn thin at the sole, the beadwork faded. She's asleep in the other room, gray-haired now like me, and Creek is grown with children of her own. And the lodge is different, and the world is different, and the creek still runs through the valley below us, clear, over brown stones. I put my hand on the moccasin sometimes, late at night, and I feel the stitches she set, each one a choice, each one a staying. She saved my life. Not once, once is the creek. She saved it every morning after, just by being there when I woke up, just by staying. The moccasins are in my lap, the fire is low, the creek is running. That's enough. That's the whole of it.